The city was busy as always. Cars moved fast on the roads, horns filled the air, and people walked quickly on the sidewalks with their eyes on their phones or on the ground. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry, rushing to their jobs, schools, or shops. Among this fast life, one man sat quietly at the corner of the street. His clothes were old and torn. His shoes were worn out, and one of them had a hole big enough to show his toes. His beard had grown long, and his hair was messy. He looked tired, but his eyes carried a strange kind of calmness. His name was Ravi, though very few people knew that. To most, he was just another homeless man, another face in the crowd of people who had nothing. He sat on the hard pavement with a small cardboard sign resting against his knees. The words were written in shaky handwriting, "Hungry. Can I play piano for food?" Some people glanced at the sign and walked past without saying anything. A few looked at it and gave a small smile, but not the kind of smile that carried kindness. It was the kind of smile people gave when they saw something they could not believe. A homeless man talking about piano? It sounded strange, even funny to them. Many thought he must be joking, while others thought he must have lost his mind. After all, what could someone living on the streets know about such a beautiful instrument? But Ravi did not mind their thoughts. He had been sitting in the same spot for weeks now, watching the world pass him by. He had learned that people always judge quickly. They looked at his clothes, his face, his sign, and decided what he was worth. Very few had the patience to stop and ask, "Who are you really?" The truth was something none of them could imagine. Once, long ago, Ravi's life had been very different. He had worn fine suits, lived in warm houses, and traveled to places where the sound of his music filled halls with joy. But now, all that was gone. All that remained was his memory of the piano, the only thing that had never left him, even when everything else had. The street around him was noisy, but inside his heart, Ravi heard melodies. Sometimes, as he sat in the cold, he closed his eyes and let his fingers move in the air as if he were pressing invisible piano keys. People who walked by thought he was strange, but in those moments, he was alive again. He could almost hear the notes dancing, soft and gentle, wrapping him in comfort. On this particular day, the sun was bright but the wind was sharp. Ravi shivered under his thin coat. A group of young office workers passed by, laughing among themselves. One of them noticed the sign and stopped. He read it out loud and chuckled, "Hungry. Can I play piano for food? Who writes this kind of thing?" His friends laughed too. One of them said, "Maybe he means a toy piano from the market." They laughed louder and walked away, leaving Ravi sitting silently. He did not get angry. Instead, he smiled faintly, though his heart felt heavy. He had faced laughter many times before, not only on the streets but also in life. The laughter of others no longer cut him as deeply as hunger did. He gently placed the cardboard sign down and folded his arms against his chest, trying to keep warm. As the day passed, more people walked by. Some dropped a few coins in his small tin can, others avoided looking at him completely. Children sometimes stared at him curiously, asking their parents why the man had a sign about a piano. Most parents pulled their children away quickly, not wanting them to ask too many questions. Ravi's stomach growled with hunger, but he stayed quiet. He knew that one day, someone might stop and ask him to prove his words. Someone might give him the chance to touch real piano keys again. Until then, he would wait. Patience was something he had learned from both the battlefield and the music hall. The city lights began to turn on as the evening approached. the street filled with golden colors as the sun slowly set. Ravi leaned back against the wall, looking at the sky above the tall buildings. Another day, he whispered to himself. His voice was soft, almost lost in the sound of traffic. He closed his eyes for a moment, and in the silence of his heart, he began to play again. The piano existed only in his imagination, but to him, the sound was real. Those passing by had no idea that the man they laughed at was once a master of the piano, a veteran who had given years of his life to serve his country, and an artist whose music had once touched thousands of hearts. To them, he was just a homeless man with a strange sign. But destiny had a way of turning at the right moment. Very soon, the world would discover who Ravi really was. The night was cold, and Ravi sat curled against the wall, his thin coat barely keeping away the chill. The streets grew quieter as the shops closed one by one, their shutters falling with loud metallic sounds. People disappeared into the comfort of their homes, leaving the pavements empty except for a few who had nowhere else to go. Among them was Ravi, sitting quietly, holding on to his cardboard sign like it was the last piece of his identity. Long ago, Ravi had lived a life no one could imagine now. Before he became a man with nothing, he was a soldier who had once worn his uniform with pride. He remembered the day he had joined the army. His parents were proud, his neighbors praised him, and his own heart was filled with courage. He wanted to serve, to protect, to give back to the land where he was born. The training was hard, the days were long, and the nights were often sleepless. But Ravi never complained. He was strong then, and he believed in duty. He saw things on the battlefield that most people never would. The sounds of gunfire, the cries of wounded men, and the endless nights of waiting taught him patience but also left scars that no one could see. He returned alive, but a part of him had stayed back in those dusty fields of war. When others clapped for the returning soldiers, Ravi stood among them with a smile on his face, but deep inside, he carried memories that followed him everywhere. Life after the army was not what he had imagined. The world had moved on quickly, and opportunities were scarce. His parents had passed away during his service years, leaving him with no close family. Friends were busy with their own lives. Slowly, Ravi found himself standing alone, holding medals that meant respect but not food, honor but not shelter. He worked odd jobs for a while, but the weight of his silent battles grew heavier each day. Yet there was one thing that gave him strength: music. Even before the army, Ravi had been a pianist. As a child, he would sit at an old upright piano in his school, pressing the keys carefully until melodies began to flow. His teacher had once told him, "You have magic in your hands." That magic carried him to bigger stages as he grew older. He had played in community halls, at cultural events, even in small concerts where people clapped with joy. But war took him away from the piano. Years passed without practice. When he came back, broken and searching for a new path, he tried to return to music. He sat at a piano again, and though his fingers moved slower, the music was still there. It poured out of him like a river that had been blocked for too long. For some time, music saved him. It was his friend when no one else was there. But soon, life's struggles caught up again. The concerts ended, the opportunities closed, and the money dried up. With no home, no job, and no one to depend on, Ravi slowly sank into the life of the streets. His piano was gone, sold for survival. All he had left were the memories of melodies that lived inside his mind. Now, when people saw him with a sign about piano, they laughed. They thought it was only a joke, because to them, the idea of a homeless man being a pianist was impossible. They did not know the long road he had walked, the sacrifices he had made, and the beauty he once shared with the world. As Ravi sat there under the streetlight, he remembered a night from years ago. He had played at a hall filled with people. The stage lights had been warm, and the sound of the piano filled every corner of the room. When he finished, the crowd had stood, clapping and cheering his name. He could still see their faces, glowing with happiness. That memory was like a small fire inside him. It kept him alive, even when the world outside was cold. The next morning, Ravi woke up stiff and hungry. The sun rose slowly, casting golden light on the tall buildings. He picked up his sign again and placed it carefully in front of him. He had no coins left from the previous day, but he still had hope. Somewhere deep inside, he believed that one day, someone would give him a chance. One day, his hands would touch real piano keys again, and he would remind the world who he truly was. For now, he remained just another man on the street, invisible to most. But within him lived two identities: one, the forgotten veteran who had served his land; the other, the pianist whose music still whispered in his soul. And though the world did not see it yet, destiny was slowly preparing a moment when the two parts of Ravi's life would come together again. The morning air was sharp, and Ravi sat at his usual spot near the cafe on the corner. The cardboard sign rested against his knees, its words faded but still readable: "Hungry. Can I play piano for food?" His tin can held only a few coins from the day before, not enough to buy even a single proper meal. His stomach growled, but he remained calm. Hunger had become a companion to him, one he had learned to live with. People passed quickly as always. Some glanced at him, others turned their eyes away. A few dropped small coins into his tin can without a word. Children tugged their parents' hands, curious about the man with the strange sign, but parents hurried them along. Ravi's fingers moved slightly, as if he were playing invisible keys in the air. He did this without thinking. His hands remembered the piano even when his body was weak. It was mid-morning when a group of young men came walking down the street. They were dressed neatly in office clothes, their shirts tucked in, ties hanging loosely around their necks. They were laughing and talking loudly, enjoying their break from work. As they reached the corner where Ravi sat, one of them noticed the cardboard sign. He stopped and bent forward to read it carefully. "Hungry. Can I play piano for food?" he read aloud, then burst into laughter. His friends turned their heads and soon joined in. One of them smirked and said, "Play piano? On the street? Where's the piano, uncle?" Another chuckled, "Maybe he means a toy piano. You know, the colorful ones for kids." The group laughed harder. Their voices were not cruel in the deepest sense, but careless in the way of people who never think about another man's pain. Ravi looked at them quietly, his eyes calm, his lips forming a faint smile. He had heard laughter like this many times. It no longer surprised him. "Come on, let's go," one of them said, waving his hand. "We're wasting time here." But the first man wasn't done yet. He leaned closer to Ravi and asked mockingly, "So, old man, do you really know how to play piano? Or is it just a trick to get money?" Ravi's voice was soft when he answered, "I play. It is all I know." The young men laughed again, shaking their heads. They found the idea amusing, as if the man sitting on the cold ground could not possibly hold such talent. They did not believe him. To them, his claim was nothing more than another story told by someone who had lost his way. "All right then," said one, pretending to be serious. Play something for us right now. Let's see. His friends laughed harder. They knew there was no piano nearby, and they expected silence or excuses. Ravi only looked at them for a moment, then slowly lifted his hands. His fingers moved gently in the air, pressing invisible keys. His eyes closed as he imagined the sound. To him, the street disappeared, replaced by a hall filled with the warm glow of stage lights. The notes flowed in his mind soft, rising, falling, painting a picture no one else could hear. The young men watched in confusion for a moment, then one of them laughed loudly. Look! He's playing the air. An invisible piano. The others joined in, their laughter echoing down the street. A few passers-by glanced at the scene but kept walking. To them, it was just another odd moment in a busy city. Ravi did not stop. His hands kept moving, graceful and steady. Inside his heart, the music was alive. He could hear every note, every chord, every pause. For him, it was real. The laughter around him could not drown it out. After a few minutes, he lowered his hands and opened his eyes. The young men had grown bored. Their laughter was softer now, replaced by shrugs. One of them tossed a small coin into the tin can and said, "Good show, maestro. Buy yourself some bread." The sarcasm in his voice was sharp, but Ravi simply nodded. They walked away, still chuckling among themselves, leaving Ravi alone again. He picked up the coin and placed it carefully in the tin. It was not much, but it was something. He whispered softly, "Thank you." As the day went on, Ravi thought about what had happened. The laughter did not hurt him the way it once might have. He had learned that people laugh when they do not understand. They laughed at his clothes, his sign, his claim of being a pianist. But deep inside, Ravi knew the truth. He was not a beggar pretending to be something he was not. He was a pianist who had lost everything but his music. Evening began to fall, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The cafe nearby lit its lamps, and the smell of fresh bread drifted out onto the street. Ravi closed his eyes once more and let the invisible keys guide him. One day, he believed, someone would stop not to laugh, not to mock, but to listen. And when that moment came, the world would hear the truth in his hands. The evening streets were alive with color. Lights from the shops and cafes glowed softly as people hurried to buy their last items of the day. The smell of roasted corn and fresh bread drifted through the air, mixing with the sharp chill of the wind. Ravi sat quietly in his usual spot near the cafe, his cardboard sign resting against his knees. His tin can was almost empty. Only a few coins clinked inside, far from enough to buy him a meal. Inside the cafe across the street, the owner, a kind woman named Meena, was cleaning the counter. She had noticed Ravi many times before. For weeks, she had seen him sitting outside with that strange sign about the piano. At first, she had thought little of it. She assumed it was another way for a homeless man to catch attention. But something about the calm in his eyes made her pause. He did not beg loudly. He did not shout for money. He only sat silently, waiting. That evening, as she looked out through the glass window, she saw a group of young men laughing near him. She could not hear their words, but she could see Ravi's stillness while the others walked away laughing. Something stirred in her heart. She wiped her hands on her apron, stepped outside, and crossed the street. Ravi looked up when he heard footsteps stop in front of him. Meena stood there, her face gentle but curious. "I've seen your sign," she said softly. "Do you really play the piano?" Ravi's tired eyes met hers. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, in a low but steady voice, he replied, "Yes. It is the only thing I know well." Mina studied him carefully. His clothes were torn, his hair messy, but there was no lie in his tone. Something about the way he spoke made her believe him. She thought about the piano sitting inside her cafe, dusty and unused. It had been her father's, but no one had touched it in years. It was more decoration than instrument now. She smiled kindly. "Come. There is a piano in my cafe. Play something for us." For a second, Ravi's heart almost stopped. Could it be true? A real piano? He blinked, unsure if this was a dream. Then he slowly nodded and got to his feet. His legs were stiff, and his steps unsteady, but he followed her inside. The cafe was warm, filled with the smell of coffee and baked bread. A few customers sat at tables, sipping tea and chatting. They looked up in surprise when they saw Mina guiding a homeless man to the corner where the piano stood. Some of them frowned, wondering what was happening. Others whispered quietly. Ravi walked to the piano as if approaching an old friend. His hands trembled slightly as he touched the wooden surface. Dust clung to the keys, but to him, it was still beautiful. He sat on the stool, his back straightening, his shoulders lifting as though a new life flowed into him. The young men who had mocked him earlier happened to pass by the cafe window. When they saw him sitting at the piano, they burst out laughing again. They pushed the door open and came inside, eager to see the joke unfold. "This will be fun," one of them whispered loudly. Ravi ignored them. His hands hovered above the keys, uncertain for just a moment. Then, with a deep breath, he pressed the first note. The sound was soft, but rich. The cafe went silent. Every head turned toward him as his fingers began to move across the keys. At first, the notes were slow, gentle, like the opening of a story. Then they grew stronger, flowing like a river after the rain. His body swayed with the rhythm, and his fingers danced with grace. The young men stopped laughing. Their smiles faded as they watched in shock. This was no clumsy attempt. This was music alive, breathing through every touch of his hands. Mina stood near the counter, her eyes wide with wonder. She had expected simple playing, maybe a small tune. But what she heard was something much greater. It was full of emotion, joy, pain, hope, and sorrow all mixed together. It felt as if every note carried a piece of his life, every chord spoke of battles fought and dreams lost, and every pause was a memory too heavy for words. Customers who had been chatting before now sat frozen, their cups untouched. The cafe filled with a silence that belonged only to the music. Outside, even people walking past stopped near the window, drawn by the sound. The city noise faded in their ears, replaced by the melody pouring out from Ravi's hands. The young men who had mocked him looked at each other in shame. They had laughed at him, called him a joke, but now they realized the truth. The man they had dismissed as a beggar was a master, someone far beyond their shallow judgment. Ravi closed his eyes as he played. For him, time disappeared. He was not in a cafe anymore. He was back on stage, lights warm on his face, an audience waiting in silence. He could hear the applause that once filled his life, feel the energy of people rising to their feet. But this time, the music was deeper. It carried not just skill but the weight of years, the silence of the streets, and the hunger that had walked beside him. When the final note faded into the air, the cafe remained silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, people began to clap. First a few, then everyone. The sound of applause filled the cafe, louder and louder, echoing against the walls. Ravi opened his eyes, his hands still resting on the keys. Tears formed in the corners of his eyes, but he did not wipe them away. He had finally touched the piano again. And for the first time in many years, people had listened. The sound of clapping still echoed in the cafe. For a long moment, Ravi sat with his hands resting gently on the piano keys. His heart beat fast, but his face showed only calm. The warmth of the cafe lights touched his tired skin, and the glow of the applause wrapped around him like a blanket. After years of silence, he had finally been given a chance to let his music breathe again. The customers leaned forward in their seats, whispering to one another. Some asked, "Who is he?" Others simply shook their heads in disbelief. How could a man who lived on the street, with torn clothes and worn shoes, play with such beauty? It felt impossible, like a dream. The young men who had mocked him earlier now sat at the back, their laughter gone. Shame burned on their faces as they watched the man they had called a joke transform into something they could not deny a master. They avoided each other's eyes, unable to laugh anymore. Meena, the cafe owner, felt her throat tighten. She had invited him to play with curiosity, maybe even pity. But what she had just heard was something far greater than she had expected. The notes had carried stories, emotions, and truth. She wiped a small tear from the corner of her eye, whispering to herself, "This is no ordinary man." Ravi sat still for a moment longer. Then, as if drawn by something inside him, he lifted his hands again. The cafe went quiet at once. Even those standing outside the window pressed closer, waiting. And then, with gentle care, Ravi pressed the keys again. The first note rang out, soft yet full of life. It was like the sound of dawn breaking after a long night. His fingers began to move smoothly, painting the air with music. Each chord rose and fell like the tide of the sea. The melody spoke of sorrow but also of hope, of journeys long and tiring, yet filled with strength. The cafe was silent except for his music. The clinking of cups, the shuffle of chairs, the hum of chatter all stopped. People sat frozen, listening with their hearts. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound carry them away. Others stared at Ravi's hands, unable to believe that such beauty could come from fingers so thin and worn. One elderly man at a corner table leaned forward, his eyes wide. He whispered to his wife, "I know this style, this is the playing of a trained pianist. Not just trained, gifted." His wife nodded silently, tears forming in her eyes. As Ravi played, his memories guided him. Each note carried a piece of his past. He remembered his childhood, sitting at the old upright piano in his school hall. He remembered his teacher smiling proudly, telling him he had magic in his hands. He remembered nights after training in the army when he found a piano in the camp hall and played softly, letting the music hide his fears. The melody changed, becoming faster, stronger, filled with fire. It was as if Ravi was telling his entire life story through the keys. The customers felt it too. They could sense the struggle, the loneliness, the silent strength. The music seemed to pull at their hearts, making them feel things they could not explain. One young woman at a table near the piano wiped her cheeks, whispering, This is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." A man beside her nodded, unable to speak. The young men who had laughed earlier sat frozen, their faces pale. They realized now how wrong they had been. The old man they had mocked was not a joke. He was something extraordinary. They looked at each other, their pride broken, their hearts heavy with guilt. Outside, People gathered near the windows. Some pressed their faces against the glass to see the man playing. Others stood quietly, listening through the small opening of the cafe door. The street outside grew quiet too. Even the sound of traffic seemed distant compared to the power of the piano inside. Ravi lost himself completely in the music. He was no longer a homeless man sitting in a cafe. He was once again the artist he had been, the pianist who had touched thousands of hearts. He could hear the echo of applause from long ago, see the glow of lights on stage. But this time, the music was different. It carried not just skill but the weight of hunger, the pain of loneliness, the long road of survival. Every note was honest. The piece reached its peak, his fingers moving faster, pressing harder, pouring out the last drops of his soul. Then, slowly, the melody softened, like the setting sun. The final notes drifted into silence, delicate as falling leaves. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The cafe was silent, as if the whole world had stopped breathing. Then, suddenly, the room filled with applause. Loud, thunderous, heartfelt applause. People stood up, clapping with all their strength. Some whistled, some cried, some shouted bravo. Meena clapped too, her face glowing with pride. She looked at Ravi with new eyes. No longer did she see a tired old man on the street. She saw an artist, a man who had given his life to music. Ravi bowed his head slightly, his hands still resting on the keys. His heart was full. For the first time in years, he was not invisible. For the first time in years, people saw him not as a homeless man, but as who he truly was. The sound of applause rolled through the cafe like thunder. People clapped with such energy that the walls seemed to shake. Some were smiling with joy, others had tears streaming down their faces, and a few simply stood in silence, their hearts still caught inside the music. Ravi sat quietly at the piano, his hands resting gently on the keys. He lowered his head slightly, almost shy of the attention. For years, he had lived in silence, ignored and invisible on the streets. Now, suddenly, every eye in the room was fixed on him. "Who is he?" someone whispered from the corner. "Where did he learn to play like that?" An elderly man sitting near the window leaned forward, his face pale with realization. His hands shook slightly as he pointed toward Ravi. "I know that touch," he said in a trembling voice. "I know that style. This is no ordinary man. This is Ravi Narayan." The room went still. The name hung in the air like a spark. A few people frowned, confused. Some looked at each other, unsure of what they had just heard. But others gasped, recognition lighting their faces. "Ravi Narayan," a woman asked softly. "The pianist? The one who used to play in grand halls?" "Yes," the old man said with certainty now. "I saw him many years ago. I was in the audience when he performed in the city hall. He played with such passion, such soul. I could never forget. And now, hearing him again, there is no doubt. This is him." The whispers grew louder. People pulled out their phones, searching the name. Old photographs, posters, and recordings appeared on their screens. They compared the young man in the pictures dressed in fine suits, smiling beside a piano with the tired, bearded man now sitting in front of them. His hair was grayer, his face thinner, but the fire in his hands was the same. "It's true," one customer said, showing his phone to others. "Look. This was him. He was a legend once." The cafe filled with a new kind of silence, not the silence of listening, but the silence of respect. All at once, people realized the truth. The man they had walked past every day, the man they had ignored and laughed at, was not just a beggar with a strange sign. He was a master, a veteran, and a legend who had once stood on great stages. The young men who had mocked him earlier sat frozen in their chairs. Their hearts pounded with guilt as they remembered their cruel laughter. They lowered their eyes, unable to meet Ravi's gaze. For the first time, they felt the weight of their carelessness. Meena, the cafe owner, stood behind the counter with her hand pressed to her chest. Her eyes glistened with tears. She had invited him in out of kindness, but now she realized she had given a stage back to someone who truly belonged to it. A legend, she whispered. And I almost left him out on the street. Ravi looked up slowly, his eyes scanning the room. He saw the faces of the crowd, wide with wonder, full of questions. He heard the whispers, the recognition, the sudden change in how they saw him. But inside, he felt calm. Fame was not what he longed for. He had lost that long ago. What mattered now was that someone had listened, that the music inside him had finally found a voice again. A man in a suit approached him carefully. "Sir, is it true? Are you really Ravi Narayan, the pianist?" Ravi gave a small smile. His voice was quiet but steady. "Once, long ago, that was my name. But music has never left me." Gasps filled the room again. People began to clap once more, not just for the performance but for the man himself, for his courage, his resilience, his return. One young woman near the front table stood and said, "You are not forgotten anymore." Her voice carried across the cafe, and many nodded in agreement. The young men who had mocked him earlier slowly rose to their feet. One of them stepped forward, his face red with shame. We are sorry," he whispered. His friends nodded quickly, their heads bowed. "We did not know who you were. We did not know what you carried inside." Ravi looked at them with gentle eyes. He did not scold them. He simply said, "Music is not about who I am. It is about what I share. Today you listened, and that is enough." His kindness cut deeper than anger would have. The young men nodded, tears stinging their eyes. Outside the cafe, the crowd had grown. People passing by stopped, whispering to each other as they learned who was inside. Some pressed their phones to the glass, recording the moment. News spread quickly, and within minutes, more and more people gathered around. Inside, the customers stayed seated, unwilling to leave. They wanted to hear more, to see more, to hold on to this once-in-a-lifetime moment. Ravi remained seated at the piano, his hands resting gently on the keys. For the first time in years, he felt no hunger, no cold, no loneliness. He felt only peace. The world had seen him again not just as a man on the street, but as the pianist he had always been. And though his life had been filled with loss and silence, in that cafe, with strangers gathered in awe, Ravi Narayan was no longer invisible. He was a hidden legend who had finally stepped back into the light. The cafe was alive with energy. The sound of applause, whispers of wonder, and the hum of awe-filled conversation filled the room. Ravi sat quietly at the piano, his hands resting lightly on the keys. For the first time in years, he did not feel invisible. The recognition of his talent, the respect in the eyes around him, and the warmth of kindness made him feel alive in a way he had not felt for decades. People had gathered not only inside the cafe but also outside, pressing against the windows, listening intently. News of the homeless pianist had spread quickly. Phones were held up, capturing every note, every movement, every moment of his quiet but powerful presence. It was as if the entire street had stopped to listen. Meena, the cafe owner, stepped forward. "Ravi," she said softly, her voice full of emotion, "you've touched all of us today. Not just with your music, but with your courage. You are welcome here anytime." Ravi looked at her with gentle eyes. He nodded, feeling a warmth that went deeper than any meal or coin. Her kindness had opened the door not only to a piano but to the possibility of a new life. People began to approach him, one by one. Some offered words of praise. Some offered opportunities, jobs, connections to music schools, invitations to play in small events. A few brought food and warm clothing. Every gesture reminded him that the world still had room for him, that he had not been forgotten entirely. The young men who had laughed at him weeks ago approached cautiously. Their heads were bowed, their expressions full of humility. "Sir," one said softly, "we were wrong to laugh at you. We did not know who you were. Please forgive us." Ravi looked at them. He could see the genuine regret in their eyes. He smiled gently. "There is nothing to forgive. Music is for sharing, not for proving who I am. Today, you listened. That is what matters." The young men nodded, relief spreading across their faces. They had learned an important lesson: never judge someone by their clothes, their appearance, or the place they stand in the world. They had laughed, but they had listened, and that was the beginning of understanding. Outside, the crowd had grown even larger. People who had been walking by stopped, drawn by the piano's sound and the story of the man who had once been a legend. Some quietly slipped money into his tin can. Others called friends, inviting them to witness the miracle of a man's talent reclaimed. Ravi felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude, humility, and hope. He had been hungry, cold, and alone for so long, but in that moment, he realized that life could still offer beauty. Music had carried him this far, and now, the world was ready to listen. He sat at the piano once more and pressed a single key. The sound was soft, almost delicate, but it captured everyone's attention. Slowly, he began to play again, letting his hands move freely over the keys. The melody was gentle at first, then rose in strength and clarity, telling a story of hardship, resilience, and hope. The cafe transformed. People who had been strangers only moments ago now shared a connection through the music. Their faces showed understanding, empathy, and wonder. Each note that floated through the air reminded them of life's hidden stories, the talent that often went unnoticed, and the beauty that could be found in the most unlikely places. Ravi played for a long time. When he finally lifted his hands, silence filled the room once again. But this silence was different. It was full, complete, and respectful. Slowly, the applause returned, louder and more heartfelt than before. Meena placed a warm meal in front of him. He looked at it and smiled softly. He had been hungry not only for food but for recognition, for understanding, for a chance. Today, he had received all of it. "Ravi," she said, her voice filled with warmth, "we can help you. Not just with food, but with your music. People want to hear you play. Would you like to perform again?" Ravi nodded, his eyes shining. "Yes," he whispered. "I would like that very much." The cafe erupted in quiet celebration, not with noise but with smiles, tears, and kind gestures. Strangers approached to shake his hand, to express their admiration, to welcome him into their hearts. Outside, the crowd cheered softly, happy to witness the transformation of a man who had been invisible into someone celebrated. That night, Ravi walked back to the small shelter he called home, not alone but with hope lighting his path. His hands still carried the memory of the keys, the sound of applause ringing in his ears. He felt a new beginning, a life where he would be seen, where his music would touch hearts, and where the world would finally know the man behind the sign. For the first time in many years, Ravi felt whole again. The streets had been cruel, life had been harsh, and laughter had once cut deep. But now, he knew something important: talent cannot be hidden forever, truth cannot be ignored, and kindness can arrive at the most unexpected moment. As he closed his eyes that night, the melodies he had carried for so long played softly in his mind. The piano in the cafe had been a bridge, connecting his past with a future filled with hope. Tomorrow, he would return not as a man on the street, not as a forgotten veteran, but as Ravi Narayan, the pianist who had been reborn. And for the first time in years, he truly smiled, knowing that life had given him a second chance.